He had been arrested over 40 times. 40 times. Let that sink in for a second. Local detectives, federal agents, the NYPD, they all tried. They all came with handcuffs. They all thought they would be the one to finally break the most powerful black crime boss in American history. And every single time, Bumpy Johnson walked out that door, free, smiling, every single time, until one man came to Harlem with a different strategy. He didn't come with handcuffs. He didn't come with backup. He didn't come with a team. He came alone, with a file built from the ground up, so airtight, so calculated, so devastatingly thorough, that for the first time in his entire life, Bumpy Johnson sat across a table from a law enforcement officer and had absolutely nothing to say. Nothing. The most untouchable man in Harlem. Speechless. And when I tell you what was in that file, you're going to lose your mind. But before we get into this, my sister has something to say. 2 seconds.
Yeah. My big brother sat across from me, and I told him he could never get 500 subscribers. He laughed at me. Ha ha ha. He told me I trust my community, and I want to win the prize. I will be waiting to get my prize.
So right now you heard what she said. If this story already has your attention, please hit subscribe, smash that like, and share this to one person who loves real history. Because I made that bet with full confidence, knowing you guys would come through. Help me prove my big sister wrong. Okay, let's go. Because this story is unreal. Here's a question nobody asks. 40 arrests. 40. And not one conviction stuck. So, what changed in 1952? What was different about this time, compared to every other time law enforcement came for Ellsworth Raymond Johnson? Hold that question, because the answer is not what you think. Summer 1952, Harlem, New York. Bumpy Johnson is not hiding. He is not running. He is in Jet magazine. Not the crime section, the celebrity section. Right there, alongside Sugar Ray Robinson. Photographed, named, celebrated. In Harlem, he is not a criminal. He is a pillar. When a family ran out of food, Bumpy sent groceries. When a widow couldn't make rent, Bumpy covered it. When the city looked away from Black Harlem, Bumpy showed up. That was his genius. And that was his armor. Because you cannot convict a man the community will never testify against. Then the federal papers land. Conspiracy to distribute heroin. 15 years. Bumpy looked at those papers, and he said, I was framed. Half of Harlem believed him. The other half? They were scared, because if Bumpy could fall, nobody was safe. But here is what makes this moment strange. Law enforcement had been trying to bury this man for over 2 decades. Local cops, NYPD detectives, state investigators. 40 attempts, 40 failures. And suddenly, one federal file walks through the door and it works. Why? Because every detective before 1952 made the same mistake. They came for Bumpy Johnson the criminal. This investigator came for Bumpy Johnson the man. And the moment you understand a man, you understand exactly where he is most exposed. But to understand a man, you have to go back. Way back. Before Harlem. Before the legend. Before the fear. Back to a teenage boy stepping off a train from Charleston, South Carolina, arriving in a city that already decided he did not matter. And what that boy did next, in the streets of Harlem, would put over 40 people in the ground. Some of them were enemies. Some of them were not. And the war he started was the very thing that made him impossible to stop. But it also created the one crack, the one vulnerability, that nobody found until they did. Stay with me. Before we talk about how Bumpy Johnson became untouchable, we need to talk about who made him. Because nobody built a legend alone. Harlem, early 1930s. This neighborhood is not what most people picture when they think of New York. No skyscrapers, no tourist maps. Just block after block of working black families, shut out of banks, shut out of corporate jobs, shut out of every legitimate system America had to offer. So they built their own. It was called a numbers racket. Every single morning, people across Harlem placed small bets, coins, a few dollars, on a 3-digit number. If your number hit, you could pay your rent for a month. It was illegal. Everyone knew it. Nobody cared. Because it was the only financial system that actually worked for them. And one woman controlled all of it, Madame Stephanie St. Clair. They called her the Queen of Numbers. Sharp, fearless, untouchable in her own right. She had lawyers on speed dial, politicians in her pocket, and the loyalty of an entire community. But even a queen needs someone she trusts completely. So here's the question. Out of every man in Harlem, who did she choose? Not the biggest, not the loudest, not the most feared. She chose a quiet young man with a small bump on the back of his skull. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Bumpy. And this is where the story gets interesting. Because Bumpy was not what people expected an enforcer to be. He read Shakespeare, actual Shakespeare. He wrote poetry, carried books, played chess the way most men played cards, obsessively, patiently, always 10 moves ahead. But cross him, disrespect St. Clair's operation, he became something else entirely. That combination, patience and precision, made him the most dangerous man in Harlem before he turned 30. St. Clair saw it immediately. She gave him power. He used it carefully. The operation grew. The money grew. The loyalty grew. For a moment, it felt unshakable. Then Dutch Schultz got off a train, and everything that felt solid cracked. Dutch Schultz was not a local problem. The FBI had him listed as public enemy number 1. He ran bootlegging operations across the Northeast. Brutal, calculated, expanding. And in the early 1930s, he looked at Harlem's numbers operation and made a decision. He wanted it. His message to every black numbers banker in Harlem was simple. Hand it over or face consequences. One by one, they folded. Smart men, experienced men, men who had survived Harlem streets for decades. They looked at Dutch Schultz and they stepped aside. Every single one, except 2 people. Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson. They said no. Out loud. Directly. No. Do you understand what that meant? Saying no to Dutch Schultz in 1930s New York was not a business decision. It was a declaration of war. And Dutch Schultz responded the only way he knew how. Harlem became a war zone. Over 40 people were killed in the conflict that followed. Kidnappings, ambushes, bodies found in places bodies should never be found. The NYPD watched. The papers reported. The city held its breath. And Bumpy Johnson stood in the middle of all of it, not hiding, not negotiating, present. This war lasted years. And when it finally ended, it did not end the way Dutch Schultz planned. But here's what nobody tells you about how it actually ended, and who actually won. Because the answer is not who threw the last punch. The answer is who was still standing when the smoke cleared. Let me ask you something. When 2 sides go to war, how do you know who actually won? Is it the last man standing? Is it the one who threw the first punch? Or is it the one who never had to throw a punch at all? Hold that question. Because the answer is in what happened next. Dutch Schultz did not ease into Harlem. He came in like a demolition crew. Threats, violence, pressure. His men moved through the streets, making it clear this operation now belongs to us. And Harlem folded, block by block, banker by banker, except one block, except one operation. Bumpy and St. Clair looked at everything Dutch Schultz was doing and chose the opposite direction. They hit back, not emotionally, not recklessly, surgically. Bumpy dismantled Schultz's street presence piece by piece. Betting parlors gone. Enforcers removed. Lookouts neutralized. Over 40 of Schultz's people vanished from Harlem streets. Some were killed. Some were handed directly to the NYPD. because St. Clair had been quietly feeding law enforcement information about Schultz's operations for months. Think about that strategy for one moment. She used the same police force that had harassed her community for years as a weapon against her enemy. That is not desperation. That is genius. And while Bumpy handled the streets, St. Clair went higher. She contacted the federal government directly and handed them detailed information about Dutch Schultz's tax evasion and political corruption. The man who thought he was coming to take Harlem was now being dismantled from every direction simultaneously. Street level, police level, federal level. Schultz was furious. And a furious man makes decisions that a calm man never would. So he made one, the worst decision of his life. He went to Lucky Luciano. Now, if you know anything about organized crime in 1930s New York, you know that name. Lucky Luciano was not just powerful. He was the architect of the modern American Mafia, the boss above bosses, and Schultz sat across from him with a proposal. He wanted to assassinate Thomas Dewey, the district attorney who was actively prosecuting him. A sitting prosecutor in New York City. Schultz genuinely believed this was a reasonable idea. Luciano listened. He did not agree, not because he had any moral objection, but because he understood something Schultz had stopped being able to see. Killing a district attorney would bring a level of federal attention that the entire mafia structure could not survive. Every operation, every family, every city, gone. So Lucky Luciano made a different call entirely. He decided Dutch Schultz was a problem. October 25th, 1935. Newark, New Jersey. Schultz walked into a restaurant called the Palace Chop House. Assassins were already inside. He was shot, and unlike most men who get shot at that level, he did not die immediately. He lived for 22 hours. Delirious, rambling, asking questions nobody in that hospital room could answer. And while he lay there, a telegram arrived at his bedside. From Stephanie St. Clair. 5 words. 5. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. He died hours later. Now, most people hear that story and think, Bumpy won. St. Clair won. Harlem survived. And they are right. But here's the part that changes everything. Winning that war made Bumpy Johnson the most visible black crime figure in America. And visibility in his world was the most dangerous thing a man could have. Because the same federal government that St. Clair had used against Schultz, they had been watching, taking notes, building something. And in 1952, they opened a file. Here is something that has never made sense to most people. The Italian Mafia in 1935 controlled organized crime across every major American city. New York, Chicago, New Jersey, Philadelphia. They had rules, traditions, bloodlines. You were born into that world, or you were not in it at all. So, how did a black man from Charleston, South Carolina, end up sitting at their table? Not begging, not negotiating from weakness, but walking away with everything he came for. Hold that question, because the answer tells you exactly who Bumpy Johnson really was. Schultz was barely gone. The streets of Harlem were still unsettled. Power vacuums in criminal enterprises do not stay empty for long. Everyone was watching to see who would move first. Bumpy moved first. He requested a meeting with Lucky Luciano. Not a confrontation, not a challenge, a conversation. And Luciano, the most calculated man in organized crime, agreed to sit down. Think about what that moment looked like. Every Italian boss, every underboss, every consigliere in that room had spent their entire lives inside a system built on ethnic loyalty and inherited rank. And Bumpy Johnson walked in anyway. No Italian last name, no bloodline connection, no traditional leverage. Just a mind, and an argument so logical that Luciano could not refuse it. Bumpy laid out simply. Harlem is not your territory. It never was. You do not have the community trust to run it. You do not have the relationships. You do not have the infrastructure. But I do. Let me run Harlem. I will pay tribute. Consistent, reliable, every single time. And in return, no Italian family touches my streets without my approval. Luciano listened and agreed. That agreement should not have been possible. It had never been done before. A black independent operator maintaining full territorial control inside a system designed to exclude him entirely. Bumpy did not just survive that meeting. He rewrote the rules of it. From that moment, Harlem belonged to him. Completely. No numbers runner operated without his blessing. No loan shark set up without his approval. No dealer, no enforcer, no street-level operation of any kind moved in those blocks without Bumpy Johnson knowing about it. The money that flowed through his empire, in today's dollars, would run into the hundreds of millions, and the community still loved him. That was the part that made him impossible to prosecute. Celebrities came to Harlem to be near him. Politicians took his calls. When local police arrested him, and they did, over and over, witnesses went quiet. Cases collapsed. Evidence went cold. 40 arrests, not one conviction that held. Because a man embedded that deeply into a community does not get prosecuted by the community. He gets protected by it. Local law enforcement understood this eventually. They could not touch him from the ground up, and the Mafia had already decided he was more valuable as a partner than an enemy. So on paper, Bumpy Johnson was untouchable. On paper. But here's the thing about paper. Someone else was writing on it, far from Harlem, in a federal building. And unlike every detective who came before, this one was not trying to catch Bumpy in the act. He was building something that did not require a single witness, something that did not need the community's cooperation, something Bumpy's lawyers could not explain away, something that, for the first time in over 2 decades, made Ellsworth Raymond Johnson genuinely afraid. One word. Federal. Every cop who ever came for Bumpy Johnson made the same mistake. They came for Bumpy. That was a mistake. Here's the question that the federal investigators finally asked themselves. What if you never touch the man at the top? What if you never even look at him? What if you start at the very bottom and build upward? Hold that thought. Because the answer changed everything. Local detectives had one strategy. Watch Bumpy. Follow Bumpy. Catch Bumpy. It never worked. And here's why. Bumpy never touched anything directly. Not product. Not cash exchanges. Not street-level transactions. He had front businesses. Dry cleaning operations. Legitimate storefronts. Money moved clean. Paper looked right. And between Bumpy and any criminal act, there were layers. 3, 4, sometimes 5 people deep. By the time a detective traced anything back, the chain broke. Every time. So the Federal Narcotics Unit did something no one had tried before. They stopped looking at Bumpy entirely. They looked at the outermost layer. The smallest, most replaceable people in the operation. Street distributors. Intermediaries. Low-level runners. They arrested them quietly. Offered deals. Built confessions. Then moved one layer inward. Then another, link by link. Patient. Methodical. Completely invisible. Bumpy did not see it coming. Because nobody was watching him. By the time the chain had been fully constructed, it pointed in one direction. One name, one address. And in the summer of 1952, the same summer Bumpy Johnson appeared in Jet magazine celebrity pages, the federal indictment landed. Conspiracy to distribute heroin. 15 years. Bumpy's first response was immediate. He said he was framed, and half of Harlem stood behind him. But standing behind a man does not dissolve a federal case. This was not a local arrest built on thin evidence and one witness. This was a chain. Documented. Corroborated. Stacked. Bumpy fought anyway. He appealed. Used every connection. Every lawyer. every favor owed. And for 2 years after conviction, he was still free, fighting it through the courts, link by link, try to pull the chain apart from the top. Then he lost the appeal, and the federal government made a decision. They were not sending Bumpy Johnson to a regular federal prison, not a facility where connections could reach him, not somewhere his reputation could protect him. They sent him somewhere that had a different reputation entirely. A place surrounded by freezing water on every side. A place where the most dangerous men in America went, and most never psychologically recovered from. A place designed not just to imprison a man, but to erase him. Alcatraz, The Rock, San Francisco Bay, California, 1.5 miles from the mainland. Currents so strong that escape was considered virtually impossible. 41 acres of federal concrete sitting in the middle of open water. This is where they put Bumpy Johnson, the man who outsmarted the NYPD for 2 decades, the man who negotiated a deal with Lucky Luciano, the man who fed families, paid rent, and ran an empire worth hundreds of millions. They put him on a boat, crossed that bay, and locked him inside the rock. Now here is what nobody prepares you for. Alcatraz did not break most men physically. It broke them mentally. The silence, the isolation, the absolute removal from everything familiar. And Bumpy Johnson, a man built on community, on relationships, on the energy of Harlem streets, sat in a cell on an island, alone, for years. But here's a question you should be asking right now. Did it break him? Because what happened when Bumpy Johnson finally walked out Alcatraz is the part of this story that nobody sees coming. Let me tell you something about Alcatraz that most people do not know. It was not designed to punish men. It was designed to disappear them. The federal government did not send their most dangerous inmates there to reform them. They sent them there to be forgotten. By the public, by their communities, by everyone who ever feared them. So here's the question. What happens when you put a man whose entire power came from his mind into a place built specifically to erase that mind? Hold that, because Bumpy Johnson's answer to that question is unlike anything you would expect. Alcatraz, San Francisco Bay, California. Water temperature so low that a swimmer would lose consciousness before reaching the mainland. Currents violent enough to pull a man sideways before he made 50 yards. 1.5 miles from shore. 41 acres of federal concrete rising from the water like something the earth rejected. Al Capone served time there. Machine Gun Kelly walked those cell blocks. The most feared, most connected, most powerful criminals in American history, all reduced in numbers on a prison roster. And in 1954, Bumpy Johnson arrived. Inmate number 1117. The king of Harlem, on an island. Now here is what everyone expects to happen next. They expect Alcatraz to break him. It did not. Not even slightly. Bumpy did what it always done. He read Shakespeare, philosophy, history. He wrote poetry inside a federal prison cell on an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. He played chess. And according to men who were incarcerated alongside him, he became the most quietly respected presence in that entire facility. Not because he threatened anyone, not because he had power on the outside filtering in, but because of how his mind worked, how he carried himself, how he made people feel, even inside a place designed to make people feel nothing. The same thing that built his empire in Harlem kept him untouchable on the rock. His intellect. Years passed, and Bumpy watched, observed the routines, the guards, the patterns, the way he had always watched before every major movie ever made. Then came June 11th, 1962, and this is where the story does something unexpected. 3 inmates made their move. Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, John Anglin. For months, they had been carving to the concrete at the backs of their cells, using sharpened spoons, improvised drills, working only during the hour each day when music played loud enough to cover the sound. They built life vests from rubber raincoats, stitched together by hand, tested in secret. They constructed a raft the same way. And before they left, they placed dummy heads in their beds, sculpted from soap and plaster, with real human hair collected from the prison barber, so that guards doing night checks would see 3 sleeping men. Midnight, they climbed through the holes, up through a utility corridor, onto the roof, down to the water, and disappeared into San Francisco Bay. Their bodies were never recovered. The FBI officially lists all 3 as missing, presumed dead, to this day. It remains the only successful escape in the history of Alcatraz. Now, here is what the official FBI report does not include. Bumpy Johnson allegedly knew. Not just knew, allegedly helped arrange it. Not by escaping himself. By using connections that somehow still reached him even from inside the rock. The claim, supported by accounts from people close to him, is that Bumpy arranged for a boat to be waiting in San Francisco Bay, on the other side of those currents, on the other side of that freezing water, ready to pull those 3 men out before the cold took them. His wife, Mamie, later spoke about why Bumpy did not go himself. And her answer is the most Bumpy Johnson thing in this entire story. She said he refused. Because he did not want to leave as a fugitive. He wanted to walk out of Alcatraz as a free man, on his own terms. Through the front door, that is who he was. Even inside the most secure federal prison ever built, he was thinking 10 moves ahead. And when they finally did release him, he went straight back to Harlem. Straight back to the streets that made him. But Harlem had changed while he was gone. And what he found when he came home was not what he left behind. There's a question that nobody ever thinks to ask about Bumpy Johnson. Not about the arrests, not about the war, not about Alcatraz. The question is this: what does a man like that come home to? After nearly a decade on an island surrounded by freezing water, after years inside a cell built to make powerful men feel powerless, what is waiting on the other side of that door? Hold that question, because the answer is one of the most emotionally complicated moments in this entire story. 1963. The federal government officially closed Alcatraz. Too expensive to maintain, too old to justify. And Bumpy Johnson walked out. Nearly a decade gone. He was older, thinner, moving differently. But everyone who was there that day said the same thing. His eyes had not changed, not even slightly. He came back to Harlem. And Harlem did not quietly welcome him. They gave him a parade. Read that again. A parade. For a man the United States federal government had just held inside the most secure prison ever built on American soil. The widows he paid rent for, they were there. The families he fed during the worst months of their lives, they were there. Children who had grown up hearing his name spoken like a legend, they lined those streets. 125th Street, Harlem, New York, cheering for Bumpy Johnson. Now sit with that for a moment. Because that scene, that specific scene, tells you something that no arrest record or federal indictment ever could. It tells you what Harlem actually thought of this man. Not what law enforcement thought. Not what the papers said. What the community felt. And they felt he was theirs. But here is where the emotion of this moment gets complicated. Because while Harlem was celebrating, Bumpy was looking around. Really looking. And what he saw stopped him. The Harlem he left in 1954 no longer existed. A decade is a long time. In Harlem in 1963, it was a lifetime. Malcolm X was standing on 125th Street preaching to thousands, not asking for equality, demanding it. The civil rights movement had changed the temperature of every black neighborhood in America. A new generation had grown up while Bumpy was on that island. Young men and women who did not remember the war with Dutch Schultz, who had not watched him build his empire block by block, who only knew his name as history. And the federal government that sent him Alcatraz, they were already watching again. Files open, eyes on Harlem, waiting to see what Ellsworth Raymond Johnson would do next. So here was the reality Bumpy came home to. A community that loved him, a government that hunted him, a world that had moved forward without him, and a question he now had to answer for himself. Who was Bumpy Johnson without the empire, without the war, without the untouchable status, without the streets operating exactly as he had left them? Who was he now? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think Harlem was right to give him that parade? A man who both protected and profited from that same community. I genuinely want to see that debate. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it right now. My sister is watching that subscriber count live. She thinks this video is not going to reach the goal. Prove her wrong. Hit subscribe. Share this to one person. Let's keep going. Because what Bumpy did next would have changed Harlem, a watching government, and a world that had moved on without him, is the final chapter. And it is the one that answers everything. Stay with me. I want you to think about something. Bumpy Johnson had survived Dutch Schultz. He had survived Alcatraz. He had survived 40 arrests, federal indictments, and a decade of government pressure. So by December 1965, what do you do with a man like that? What move do you make? The answer the police chose was surveillance. Constant, suffocating, deliberate. Unmarked cars outside his building every morning. Officers on foot tracking his movement through the streets. Eyes on him everywhere he went. The strategy was not arrest. It was psychological. Make him feel watched. Make him feel small. Make him feel like a man with no room left to breathe. And most men, under that kind of pressure, fold. They keep their head down. They move quietly. They wait for it to stop. Bumpy Johnson did something else entirely. He put on his coat, walked to the nearest Harlem police station, sat down in a chair inside the building, and refused to leave, not because he was cornered, not because he had been arrested. As a protest, he looked at the officers inside that station and said, in his own words, "If you're going to watch me right here." Let that land. The most surveilled black man in New York City walked voluntarily into a police station and turned their own pressure into a public statement about the constant over-policing of black neighborhoods in Harlem. He did not raise his voice. He sat in a chair, and he waited. They arrested him. Of course they did. The charge, refusal to leave a police station. It went before a judge. The judge looked at the charge and threw it out completely. Bumpy Johnson walked out of that courtroom free. Again. But this time it was different, because this was not a criminal case collapsing due to lack of evidence. This was Bumpy Johnson using the system, the very system built to contain him, as a platform. The man who once fought a gang war for control of Harlem was now using civil disobedience as a weapon. The streets that feared him now watched him embarrass law enforcement in open court. And the people of Harlem understood exactly what they had just witnessed. But here is where the story shifts. Because while Harlem was watching that courtroom, the federal machine had not stopped. It never stopped. A new drug conspiracy case was being constructed. Carefully, quietly. The same methodical approach that brought him down in 1952 was being rebuilt from the ground up. The walls were tightening again. Bumpy could feel it. Anyone close to him could feel it. And then, on an ordinary night in Harlem, it ended. Not in a courtroom. Not in a cell. Not in a confrontation with any law enforcement officer who had spent decades trying to bring him down. It ended the only way that was ever going to be fitting for a man like Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, on his own terms, in his own world. Stay with me, because this last part is the one you will remember. Every powerful man has an ending. A bullet, a cell, a betrayal, a deal gone wrong. That is how stories like this are supposed to finish. So here's the question. How do you end the story of a man that nobody could touch? How does the universe collect someone like Ellsworth Raymond Johnson? Hold that, because the answer is the quietest thing in this entire story. July 7th, 1968, just before 2 in the morning, Harlem, New York. Bumpy Johnson walked into Wells' restaurant on 132nd Street, not hurrying, not hiding, just walking in, like he had done 1,000 times before. He was 62 years old. He had a new federal indictment hanging over him. The government, that same patient, methodical federal machine, was building another case, another file, another chain of evidence pointing in one direction. His lawyers were working. The pressure was real. But tonight, none of that was on the table. Tonight, he was just a man who was hungry. He sat down. The waitress came. He ordered coffee, a chicken leg, and hominy grits. Simple, quiet, ordinary. She brought the plate and set it in front of him. And in that moment, in the middle of a Harlem restaurant at 2 in the morning, Bumpy Johnson pressed his hand to his chest and fell. His friend Finley Hoskins was there. Someone ran down the street to the Rhythm Club, looking for Junie Bird, Bumpy's childhood friend, a man who had known him longer than most people in that room had been alive. Bird came running. He found Bumpy on the floor, and he held him, right there, on the floor of Wells' restaurant, in Harlem. And the people in that room, the ones who saw it, said something happened in those final seconds. Bumpy opened his eyes, looked up at his friend, and smiled. Then he was gone. Congestive heart failure. Age 62. No bullet found him. No cell held him. No federal indictment reached him in time. No cop. No prosecutor. No mafia boss. No rival. No judge. None of them. The man who survived Dutch Schultz's gang war, who negotiated with Lucky Luciano, who read Shakespeare inside Alcatraz, who walked into a police station and turned surveillance into protests. That man was taken by his own heart, over a plate of grits, in his neighborhood, surrounded by his world, on his terms. Even at the end, he is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery, the Bronx, New York, not far from Harlem. Close enough. And here is the thing I need you to sit with. Every institution that tried to erase Bumpy Johnson failed. The NYPD, the federal government, the Italian Mafia, Alcatraz itself. They all came. They all tried. They all left without finishing the job. The only thing that ever stopped him was time. And even then, he went out with a smile. That is not just a true crime story. That is a Harlem story. That is an American story. If this story moved you, share it right now to one person who needs to know this name. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Bumpy. Subscribe if you have not yet, because the next story is already waiting. And I promise you, it is just as unreal as this one. Let me tell you what this story is actually about, because it is not really about crime. It is not really about Harlem. It is not even really about Bumpy Johnson. It is about strategy. Every single person who came for Bumpy Johnson with force lost. Every cop who watched him, every detective who followed him, every local badge who thought physical pressure would crack him, lost. The one operation that finally broke his empire did not come with more force. It came with more patience. It stopped looking at the man at the top and started building from the ground up, layer by layer, name by name, link by link, until the chain had nowhere left to go. That lesson goes far beyond criminal justice. Know your opponent deeply enough, and their own system becomes a thing that traps them. But here is the other side of the story, the part that makes a human. Bumpy Johnson was not a clean hero. He was not a simple villain. He fed families and also flooded those same streets. He protected Harlem and also profited from its vulnerabilities. He outwitted the Italian Mafia, outlasted Alcatraz, and embarrassed the NYPD in open court, and still could not outrun a patient man with a file and enough time. That is the real story of the Godfather of Harlem. Not the legend. The man. Complicated. Brilliant. Deeply human. And gone smiling in his friend's arms. On his own terms. Till the very last breath. Now, if you are still here, you are exactly who this channel is built for. And I need one thing from you right now. My sister has been watching that subscriber count this entire video with a smile on her face. Confident, comfortable, convinced she won the bet. I need you to personally ruin that for her. Hit subscribe, hit like, and send this video to one person, just one, who loves real history. One person who needs to know the name Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Do that right now before you scroll. And drop in the comments who was more powerful, the federal machine that finally brought him down, or the man who smiled in his friend's arms at the very end. I want to see that debate. I will see you in the next one. And I promise you, the next story makes this one feel like an introduction. Let's go.